It is not dark on Luzon. Dark is what you get when someone turns off a lamp. Dark is standing in a windowless room with your eyes closed. Dark is something your brain has a word for because human beings have always been able to imagine its opposite. What wraps around Private John McKinney's foxhole at midnight on May 11th, 1945, is not dark. It is black, not an absence of light, a presence of blackness, a physical thing with weight, with texture, with a sound that has no name in the English language. The triple canopy Philippine jungle above Dingalan Bay swallows light the way the ocean swallows stone, without a ripple, without a trace, without leaving any evidence that light ever existed here at all. The blackness breathes. It smells of rot and standing water, and something that is not quite decay, but is decay's close cousin. The smell of wood returning to earth, of mud that has not seen direct sunlight in 10,000 years. The mosquitoes. And there are always mosquitoes on Luzon, fat, aggressive ones that punch straight through uniform fabric. They find McKinney's face and hands, and they do not stop. The humidity is not a percentage. It is a second skin, a warm, wet compress that the human body never adjusts to, that the U.S. Army issued no training for, that no Georgia summer could have prepared any man for. And somewhere in that black, breathing, rotting, screaming wall of jungle, they are moving. McKinney doesn't see them. You don't see anything in this jungle at midnight. But a man who spent his entire childhood learning to read the sounds of a Georgia pine wood, learning which silence means a deer froze, which silence means a hawk is watching, knows what a wrong silence sounds like. The insects stop, in a line, moving toward him. He tightens his hands on the M1 Garand rifle across his knees. In the next 7 minutes, 52 men will die on this hillside, almost all of them Japanese. And the question that has haunted military historians, Medal of Honor archivists, and combat psychologists for 8 decades is not whether it happened. The bodies proved it happened. The question is how. How does one human being, alone, in total blackness, against a trained assault force of more than 50 soldiers, not just survive, but win? To answer that, we have to go back. Back to a Georgia farm, back to an empire that believed it could not be stopped, and back to a Philippine hillside where 2 worlds collided in 7 minutes of darkness that changed one man's life forever. This channel is in the top 5 of American war history on YouTube. And stories like this one, the real ones, the ones that go deeper than any textbook, they come out every single week. If you are not subscribed yet, hit that button right now. You are going to want to see what is coming next. Appling County, Georgia. 1921. The soil in Appling County is sandy and pale, the kind of soil that drains fast and forgives nothing. You plant in it, and it gives you back exactly what you put in. No more, never more. The McKinney family farmed it. Tobacco, corn, whatever the season allowed. John Ryder McKinney was born on April 29th of that year, one of several children on a farm that demanded every pair of hands, every hour of daylight, and then a few hours more. He grew up doing what farm boys in Depression-era Georgia did. He worked, not the romantic version of farm work that certain movies like to show, not hayrides and golden sunsets, the real version. Before dawn and after dark, in heat that made the air shimmer, in cold that frosted the window panes inside. He learned how to grip a tool so your hands don't blister. He learned how to pace yourself through a 12-hour day. He learned how to keep going when every muscle in your body is telling you to stop. And he hunted. This is not a footnote. This is the first chapter of John McKinney's military biography, written before anyone knew it was a military biography. In the Georgia pine woods, hunting was not recreation, it was protein. A family that couldn't put meat on the table didn't eat. McKinney learned to shoot before he was old enough to comfortably carry a rifle. He learned to move through underbrush without announcing himself. He learned to stay completely still for 20 minutes, waiting for a deer to step into a clearing, suppressing every fidget, breathing slow and shallow, keeping his heart rate down when every instinct screamed at him to shift his weight. He dropped out of school around 8th grade. Not unusual, not shameful. A practical decision made by a family doing math that couldn't allow for education when there was work undone. By the time he was 18, he was lean and quiet and brown from the Georgia sun. He knew things about patience, accuracy, and controlled breathing under pressure that no classroom would ever teach. He had absolutely no idea that the U.S. Army was about to give him a context for all of it. Pearl Harbor came on December 7th, 1941. McKinney was 20 years old. He was inducted, trained, and assigned to Company A, 123rd Infantry Regiment, 33rd Infantry Division, a National Guard division from Illinois that had been federalized in 1941. They went through training built on hard lessons from the early Pacific campaigns. How to live in a jungle. How to fight in a jungle. How to not be killed by a jungle before the enemy even finds you. They were decent lessons. They were not sufficient lessons. Because no amount of training in the continental United States prepares a man for what the Philippine jungle actually is. Before we talk about the Japanese army, we need to talk about the other enemy, the one that doesn't appear in any casualty figures, the one that had no rank, no strategy, no commander, and could not be defeated. The Philippine jungle. Military historians sometimes describe the Luzon terrain using words like difficult or challenging. These words are accurate the way saying the Atlantic Ocean is somewhat wet is accurate. True, and they tell you absolutely nothing. Here is what the Philippine jungle in May 1945 actually was. The 33rd Division was operating in the Sierra Madre mountain range, the eastern spine of Luzon, a chain of peaks, ridgelines, and ravines where the terrain changes every 50 yards, and no two maps tell the same story because the jungle grows faster than any cartographer can document it. The mountains generated their own weather. Sudden cloudbursts that turned footpaths into rivers within minutes. Mists that descended without warning and reduced visibility to arm's length. Fog banks that settled into valleys and didn't lift for days. The heat was not temperature, it was density. Air so thick with moisture that men sweated through their uniforms before 7 in the morning and never dried out again. Wet clothing on wet skin in constant motion produced sores that became infections that became, in men already ground down by cumulative exhaustion and poor nutrition, medical emergencies. Malaria was everywhere. Dengue fever was present. Scrub typhus killed men who had survived everything the Japanese could throw at them. Jungle rot, a fungal infection that began as a simple rash and, left untreated, ate through skin and into the tissue beneath, turned scratches into wounds that required evacuation. And the insects. On Luzon in 1945, there were mosquitoes large enough to bite straight through a standard cotton uniform, leeches in every standing water source, and on Luzon, standing water was everywhere. Centipedes 12 inches long that caused intense pain and occasionally severe allergic reactions. Snakes in the undergrowth where men had to put their hands while climbing slopes too steep for upright movement. The men of the 33rd Division wrote home about it, in letters that military censors reviewed. Every letter said the same thing in different words. This is not a place where human beings are supposed to be. They called it the Green Hell. They meant every word of it. Before McKinney even faced one Japanese soldier, he was already fighting this, The heat, the darkness, the insects, the rot. Here is a question I want you to answer in the comments right now. Could you survive even one night in a jungle like this? Not fight, just survive. Drop your answer below. I read every single one. Now understand that McKinney's squad was operating in this environment at night. In total blackness, that active, breathing, crushing blackness we described at the beginning. On a ridgeline they had only occupied for 3 days, in terrain none of them fully knew. They couldn't see each other. They communicated by whisper across gaps they hoped were only a few yards wide. They sat in foxholes dug into permanently damp ground, swatting at insects they couldn't see, listening to a wall of sound so thick that identifying any single sound within it required a level of concentrated effort that is, by itself, deeply exhausting. This is where McKinney spent the hours before the attack. This is what he was managing before a single Japanese soldier appeared. The green hell wasn't a backdrop, it was a participant. And when the fight began, when the blackness suddenly had men moving through it, McKinney was already fighting on 2 fronts at once. To understand what McKinney was about to face, you have to understand something that most Western military doctrine in 1945 still struggled to fully process. The Japanese soldiers on that Philippine hillside were not going to surrender. Not because they were cowards. Not because they lacked intelligence or sophistication, but because of a belief system so deeply embedded in the structure of the Imperial Japanese Army that to surrender was, in a literal and non-metaphorical sense, to cease to exist as a person. The concept is Bushido, the way of the warrior. In its 20th century Imperial Army form, filtered through decades of nationalist propaganda and military indoctrination, it had been distilled into something simple and lethal. Death was preferable to capture. Surrender was not defeat. Surrender was the complete annihilation of the self. The Imperial Japanese Army's 1941 Field Service Code stated it explicitly. Bear in mind that to be captured means not only that you disgrace yourself, but that your parents and your family will never be able to hold up their heads again. Always save the last bullet for yourself. This was not empty rhetoric. The statistics of the Pacific War prove it with cold precision. On Attu Island in the Aleutians in May 1943, the final Japanese assault was conducted by men who were already dying of starvation and extreme cold. Of the 2,350 Japanese defenders on that island, 29 were taken prisoner. The rest died. 29 out of 2,350. On Tarawa, on Saipan, on Iwo Jima, island after island tells the same statistical story. Japanese forces fought until they were physically incapable of fighting, and then they tried to fight anyway. On Luzon, this principle had a name: Gyokusai, shattered jewels. The phrase comes from the idea that it is better to be a jewel broken gloriously than a tile preserved intact. It was the official Japanese term for a final suicidal assault, a charge by men who knew they had no military path to victory, who were surrounded and outnumbered and outgunned, choosing to die in combat rather than be captured. Gyokusai was not considered tragedy in the Imperial Army's worldview. It was considered the only acceptable response to a hopeless situation. Think about what Bushido actually meant in practice. Your entire culture, your entire military, your entire identity tells you that surrender is worse than death. Not just shameful, an erasure of everything you ever were. And the men coming at McKinney believed this completely. Here's my question for you. If you had been raised your entire life with this belief, if surrender literally meant your family lost their honor forever, would you fight to the death? Give me your honest answer in the comments. Not the comfortable answer, the honest one. General Yamashita's forces on Luzon in May 1945 were, by every military measurement, losing. They had been losing for 4 straight months. They were short of food. Some units reduced to foraging from the jungle, which in the Sierra Madre Mountains meant very little. They were short of ammunition. They had no effective air cover. Japan's once powerful air force had been shredded by attrition. They knew what the Americans were building in the Marianas Islands. They knew what was coming. And yet they attacked. Every night, somewhere on the Luzon front, Japanese forces attacked American positions. Not because it was militarily productive, because the alternative, retreating to safety and waiting to die of starvation and disease, was considered dishonorable. Now here is the strategic fact that almost every retelling of McKinney's story leaves out completely. And this is where the stakes become real, not just for one man, but for the entire Pacific War. The American artillery battery that McKinney's squad was guarding was not just a collection of guns. In the 1945 Luzon campaign, American artillery was the backbone of every offensive and defensive operation in the mountains. Yamashita's forces had no comparable fire support. Their artillery had been destroyed or captured months earlier. American artillery batteries could reach Japanese positions that infantry couldn't, could respond to night attacks faster than any other system, and could provide the suppressive fire that allowed American units to maneuver in terrain that would otherwise be suicidal to cross. A Japanese force that destroyed or overran an American artillery battery in the Sierra Madre in May 1945 achieved several critical things simultaneously. It eliminated a fire support asset that multiple American units depended on. It forced those units to reposition. It created a gap in the American line that other Japanese units could potentially exploit, and it proved that American mountain positions were vulnerable to night infiltration, which would encourage dozens more attacks of the exact same kind. 1 battery, 1 ridgeline, 9 men. McKinney didn't know the full strategic picture. He was a private. Privates guard positions. But the math was running. And if he failed that night, if that battery fell, the ripple would move up through the entire campaign. This is the kind of analysis you will not find anywhere else. Every video on this channel goes this deep. The strategy, the psychology, the human cost that gets left out of the history books. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it right now. The bell notification too, because the next story we're covering is going to absolutely break you. 9 men to guard a battery position. In military terminology, a battery guard detail like this one is designed around a concept called interlocking fields of fire. The principle is simple and elegant. You position your defenders so that each man's line of fire overlaps with the man beside him. An enemy approaching any one foxhole is exposed not just to that foxhole's fire, but to the fire from every flanking position simultaneously. There are no dead zones, no angles of approach that offer cover from multiple positions at the same time. The overlapping geometry multiplies the effectiveness of a small force dramatically. 9 men, positioned correctly on a defensible ridgeline, can hold against a force many times their size. Because the math of interlocking fire works in their favor, as long as the math holds. Here is when it stops holding. It stops holding when the terrain doesn't cooperate, when the ridgeline has blind spots, when the bamboo and undergrowth prevent clean sight lines, when foxholes have to be dug where the ground allows rather than where doctrine recommends. The Sierra Madre Mountains were not a training field. That ridgeline was not a textbook illustration. It was a real mountain covered in real jungle with real restrictions on where a man could dig without hitting rock 18 inches down. It stops holding in total darkness. Interlocking fields of fire assume you can see what you are shooting at. Or at minimum, that you can hear a threat and communicate your bearing to the men beside you. In the blackness of the Philippine jungle at midnight, with insect noise so dense it masks footsteps at 10 feet, with a triple canopy blocking every trace of starlight. The elegant geometry of interlocking fire collapses into something much more primitive. I am here. The sound is there. I am going to shoot at the sound, and it stops holding when the enemy already knows it's coming. The Japanese force that moved on McKinney's position that night had not stumbled onto it by accident. Japanese intelligence in the Sierra Madre, gathered through patient reconnaissance conducted even in their depleted state, had identified the battery position. They knew roughly where it was. They had planned their approach route. They had divided their force for a multi-point, simultaneous attack. A classic infiltration tactic, developed across years of jungle warfare in China and refined through island campaigns across the Pacific. Designed specifically to shatter interlocking defensive geometry by forcing defenders to fight in multiple directions at exactly the same moment. The plan was professional, experienced, built on a decade of jungle combat doctrine. What it did not account for was that one of the 9 Americans on that ridgeline had spent his entire life learning to fight in precisely this kind of situation. Not in a jungle, not against an army, but in the dark, alone, reading sound, staying completely still until motion was necessary, and then moving with absolute precision. A hunter's education. The Japanese force began its approach after midnight. The men in the outlying foxholes, the ones who were asleep, trusting the geometry of interlocking fire to protect them, had almost no chance. The first seconds of the attack killed or incapacitated 2 American soldiers before they could react. The perimeter that 9 men had barely been enough to cover was now, in the first heartbeats of the assault, a perimeter that 7 surviving men had to somehow hold. But one of those 7 was already awake, had been awake, was already moving. Right now, McKinney's entire defensive plan has just collapsed. The interlocking fields of fire are gone. 2 of his squad mates are already dead. It is absolute blackness, and more than 50 enemy soldiers are still moving toward him through the jungle. I want you to put yourself in that foxhole for 1 second. Your plan failed. Your friends are down. What is your very next move? Drop it in the comments right now. He heard it before he understood it. This is how it works for hunters and for soldiers who have been in combat long enough to develop awareness below the level of conscious thought. The brain processes the auditory environment at a depth below language, below reasoning, below the part of consciousness that forms sentences. It processes pattern. It registers deviation from pattern. And when the deviation is significant, when the sound that should not be there arrives, or the sound that should be there disappears, it sends a signal upward through the layers of consciousness before any rational analysis has even begun. The signal is not a thought. It is a physical sensation, a tightening, a sudden, total alertness. McKinney felt it. The insect chorus on the ridgeline had been continuous. The white noise of the green hell, the unbroken background roar of the Philippine jungle at midnight. And then, in a line, moving from his left toward his right across the hillside below his position, the insects went quiet. Not everywhere. In a line. The Japanese infiltration team was moving through the undergrowth below his foxhole. Each soldier, as he displaced the vegetation around him, disturbed the insects in his immediate vicinity. The insects went silent for the 3 or 4 feet surrounding each moving man. From McKinney's position above, what he heard, what his hunter's brain registered without his conscious mind being able to explain it, was a wave of silence moving through the sound. He was on his feet before he had decided to stand. Now let's talk about the weapon in his hands, because the technical details here matter more than most people realize. The M1 Garand is, by the consensus of military historians and competitive marksmen, one of the most effective semi-automatic service rifles ever produced. It fires a 30 caliber 30.06 Springfield cartridge, a round designed to be effective at long range against targets behind protective equipment. At the close distances that mattered on this ridgeline, the 30.06 does not wound. It stops. It passes through light cover, bamboo, thin trees, the vegetation the Japanese were using for concealment, without losing meaningful velocity. The Garand holds 8 rounds in an en-bloc clip that locks into the open receiver. When the 8th round fires, the empty clip ejects automatically with a sharp, distinctive metallic ping, a sound that became so well known in the Pacific Theater that Japanese soldiers were specifically trained to listen for it. The ping meant the American's rifle was empty. The ping meant charge. McKinney knew this. Every American infantryman in the Pacific knew this, which means he managed his ammunition with a calculation that was partly conscious and partly the automatic arithmetic of a man who had been firing rifles since childhood. Count the shots. Know when the clip is almost gone. Be ready for the reload window, and use it to move. Before McKinney could react fully, the attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. Japanese Type 38 bolt-action rifles cracking through the blackness, muzzle flashes strobing like lightning in the trees below, each flash destroying McKinney's night vision for 1 second and leaving a green afterimage that told him where a man had been a half-second ago, but not where he was now. 2 Americans died in those first seconds. The defensive geometry was gone. 7 men fighting alone in a dark that had become lethal. Except 1 man was already firing back. And he did not stop. McKinney shot at muzzle flashes, the standard technique in night combat when you cannot see your targets. Fire at the source of the enemy's fire, except that your own flash marks your position, and then move before they can zero in on you. He moved along the ridgeline. He fired, moved, fired from a new position, moved again. He covered not just his own sector, but the sectors where his squadmates had fallen, where gaps had opened and Japanese soldiers were pushing through. He fired 8 rounds. The ping. He reloaded, in the dark, under fire, with hands that the Medal of Honor citation would later describe without elaboration. He kept shooting. 7 minutes. Before we walk through what those 7 minutes actually contained, there is a conversation that serious historians have had, and continue to have, about this engagement. Because the honest answer to the question everyone asks is not simply yes. The honest answer is this. Historians examining the full body of evidence have found no reason to doubt what happened, and every reason to believe it. The distinction matters, because this is not the kind of story where you just take someone's word for it. The challenge is this. The figure of 52 enemy dead, counted by American soldiers at dawn on May 12th, represents a scale of individual combat performance that sits at the absolute outer edge of documented human capability. No responsible historian of the Pacific Campaign presents it casually. It demands examination. The examination goes like this. Could the body count have included men killed by artillery or by other Americans who arrived later? The record does not support this. Documentation indicates the engagement was completed before any reinforcement reached the position. Could some wounded men have been miscounted as dead? Possible, but a minor statistical variable given the condition of men hit by 30 caliber rounds at close range. Could 1 man actually do all of this? When the sun came up on May 12, 1945, the men who reached McKinney's position found 52 Japanese bodies distributed across the ridgeline in a pattern that told a clear story. Not clustered at one point, not the pattern of 1 man in 1 foxhole. Distributed. Moving. The bodies mapped the shape of a fight that had crossed the entire ridgeline, conducted by a defender who had not held ground, but had reclaimed it. who had replaced the interlocking fire geometry that his dead squad mates could no longer provide by himself, moving faster than 50 men could surround him. The Medal of Honor citation, vetted through an Army review process requiring multiple witness statements, official endorsement up the full chain of command, and congressional approval, records McKinney as having killed approximately 40 of the attackers. Other documentation from the 33rd Division's campaign records puts the total higher. The range of figures across primary sources reflects the inherent uncertainty of small unit night combat accounting, not any doubt about the fundamental facts. What is not in dispute by any source? He was the one who stopped them. He was the one standing at dawn. The battery was intact. The position was held. Historians have debated this for 80 years. One man, 52 dead, 7 minutes, in complete darkness. I want to know what you think. Do you believe one human being is physically capable of this? Comment yes or no, and give me one sentence explaining why. This is the kind of comment section that actually goes somewhere. Let's see what you think. So yes, humanly possible. Not easily, not without a cost that we are going to come to, but possible. Here is what happens in 7 minutes when a man makes a complete, unconditional decision that the men behind him are not going to die. He fired until his ammunition was gone. Not just one clip. Every loaded clip he had in that foxhole. The M1's distinctive pings marked the rhythm of the fight like a metronome measuring something that had no name yet. Each reload was a window of vulnerability, and in every one of those windows, he moved. Changed position. Made himself harder to locate. The Japanese force did not collapse after the first exchange. This is the Gyokusai principle in action. When men are committed to dying in the attack, when retreat is not a psychologically available option, they press forward even when the fire they are taking should logically drive them back. These men kept coming. They closed the distance. They got close enough that McKinney could hear them breathing. He shot at men he could practically touch, and then his ammunition was gone. Not his current clip. All of it. Everything he had. The Japanese kept coming. And this is the moment. This is where the fight became something that even hardened military historians struggle to describe in neutral language. Because what McKinney did when his rifle ran empty is not what training manuals recommend. It is not what most human beings are capable of. It is what a very specific kind of person does when there is no other option remaining. He grabbed the barrel of the M1 Garand and he swung it like a club. The Garand weighs 9.5 pounds, swung at full extension with 2 hands, with the full momentum of a man moving through terrain in the dark. It is not a gentle thing. The barrel is machined steel. The stock is solid walnut. It was not designed for this purpose. It performed this purpose. His ammunition is completely gone. He is in total darkness, and there are still men coming at him out of the jungle. I want you to sit with this for 1 second. No rifle, no bullets, just a heavy piece of steel in your hands, and 50 men who believe dying in this attack is the most honorable thing they can do. Comment the one single word that describes what you would feel in that exact moment. Just one word. I will read every single comment. McKinney fought in the dark, in the green hell, with a rifle he was swinging as a club, against men who had been trained their entire military lives to believe that dying in this assault was glorious. He fought them. And when even the rifle wasn't enough, when the fight closed to distances that no weapon could bridge, he fought with his hands. The bodies on the hillside the next morning showed evidence of this. Soldiers who arrived at dawn experienced combat infantrymen who had been through multiple Pacific campaigns, described what they found in terms that made clear that the final minutes of this engagement had not been a conventional firefight. Some of the Japanese dead bore wounds inconsistent with rifle fire. They bore wounds consistent with what happens when a man with absolutely no other options stops using tools and uses himself instead. McKinney, when asked about this afterward, was characteristically brief. He didn't volunteer details. He answered direct questions with direct answers and moved on. He had been asked to hold a position. He held it. At some point in those 7 minutes, the attack began to weaken. Not because the Japanese force lost its belief, because it lost its men. The survivors, the ones who had not yet closed to McKinney's position, who had watched the fight from further back in the jungle, faced a calculation that Gyokusai doctrine had not written a chapter for. They had watched a man absorb everything their force sent at him and keep moving, keep fighting, keep coming, even when his rifle was broken. The doctrine said die gloriously rather than retreat. The doctrine had not been written for this. Some withdrew into the jungle. Some were shot in the act of withdrawing. Some simply fell where they stood. The firing stopped. McKinney stood in the silence. His rifle was bent. The barrel, machined from steel, engineered to withstand thousands of rounds of high-pressure ammunition, had been physically deformed by forces in a direction and magnitude it was never designed to withstand. It was no longer a rifle. It was evidence. This is the detail that stops military historians every single time. Not the body count, not the duration, not the total darkness. The bent rifle barrel, because it is a physical document, a primary source, concrete evidence of something that human beings are generally not supposed to be capable of doing. John McKinney was capable of it, not because he was superhuman, not because he was invincible or fundamentally different from the men he served beside, but because of a precise combination, a childhood that built patience and marksmanship and physical toughness, a temperament that processed extreme stress differently from the average, and a love for the men sleeping behind him that made self-preservation secondary, that produced, in 7 minutes of Philippine jungle darkness, something that completely defied the normal arithmetic of war. Stories like this one, stories that go past the headline and into the actual human truth of what happened. This is what this channel is built for. If you are not subscribed, you are missing history told at this level every single week. Hit subscribe. Hit the bell. Do it right now while you are feeling this, because this story is not finished yet, and what comes next is going to hit even harder. 52 Japanese soldiers lay on the ridgeline and in the undergrowth below it. 2 American soldiers lay dead in their foxholes. 7 Americans were alive. One of them had just done something that would require the highest military decoration the United States of America can award. The artillery battery was intact. The sector it supported remained viable. The gap that Yamashita's forces had tried to tear open in the American line on Luzon did not open. The Pacific War's momentum that one battery had quietly been holding in place, it held. 1 man. 7 minutes. Dawn on Luzon comes like a curtain being pulled. Sudden, warm, almost theatrical after the absolute blackness of the night before. The first light revealed the ridgeline in detail, the disturbed earth, the shell casings, the blood that the pale mountain soil of Luzon held without expression. The men who came up the hill at first light stopped when they saw it. Some of them had been through Guadalcanal, some through New Guinea. Some had been fighting on Luzon since January. They had seen battlefields. They had seen the things that war produces when it gets personal and close. None of them had seen anything like this. The Luzon campaign continued for months after that May morning. General Yamashita, the man who had planned this brutal war of attrition, who had sent those 54 soldiers to McKinney's ridgeline, surrendered on September 3, 1945. He was tried for war crimes relating to the conduct of Japanese forces in the Philippines. He was hanged on February 23, 1946, at Los Baños, Luzon, the same island, the same soil. The total Luzon campaign numbers are staggering even in the context of a war that dealt in catastrophic figures. American forces, approximately 8,000 killed, 30,000 wounded. Japanese military casualties, over 200,000 dead. Filipino civilian casualties, from combat, from displacement, from Japanese reprisals, in the hundreds of thousands. The destruction of Manila alone killed an estimated 100,000 Filipino civilians in 1 month of urban combat. Against this scale, the planetary scale of the Pacific War, one man's 7 minutes on one ridgeline seems almost impossibly small. And yet, history is not made at the scale of armies. Armies are made of individual decisions, individual moments, individual people who chose one thing over another when the cost of choosing was everything they had. On October 30th, 1945, President Harry S. Truman pinned the Medal of Honor on Private First Class John R. McKinney at the White House. Truman, a former artillery captain himself, who had commanded a battery not unlike the one McKinney had guarded, reportedly told Medal of Honor recipients that he would rather have the medal than be president. Whether he said that to McKinney, the record does not confirm. What the record tells us is what McKinney did afterward. He went home, back to Appling County, Georgia. Back to the sandy soil and the pine woods and the roads he had known his whole life. He married. He farmed. He was, by every account from people who knew him in the following decades, a quiet man. The kind of neighbor whose depth you would never suspect, who didn't tell stories about himself, who didn't explain. He was exactly who he had always been, a Georgia farmer who happened to have a medal. Except, here is the part of the story that most retellings skip, because the comfortable version of a hero's story ends with the medal and the homecoming and the quiet life. It ends with dignity and closure and the suggestion that everything worked out. But inside that quiet Georgia farmer, inside the man who fixed fences and grew crops and talked about the weather, there were 7 minutes that never ended. We do not have John McKinney's diaries. We do not have the kind of extensive documented record of his inner life that some veterans of his generation left behind. What we have are fragments, accounts from people who knew him, observations from the limited interviews he gave over the decades, the patterns of his post-war life as reconstructed by historians and family. And those fragments are consistent with what combat psychologists have documented across every generation of warfare, in every culture, in every conflict where human beings have been placed in situations of extreme violence. The body comes home. The 7 minutes don't. In 1945, the condition we now call post-traumatic stress disorder did not have that name. It was called battle fatigue by the Army, shell shock by civilians who had inherited the term from the First World War. By most veterans themselves, it was called nothing. It was simply the weight you carried, the thing you didn't talk about, the experience that nobody in civilian life had the context to understand, so you just didn't bring it up. Think about what McKinney carried. He had killed men with his bare hands. Not at 300 yards, not the relatively abstracted violence of a rifle shot across a field. Close, physical, personal. The kind of violence that the human brain encodes differently from any other experience, because the sensory input is total and immediate and unforgettable. The human brain does not file that under correct decisions made under pressure. It files it under experiences that require ongoing processing. Experiences that resurface in the dark, in the small hours, in the quiet moments that civilian life offers in such abundance, with no interference to provide any cover from memory. Did McKinney ever, in the 52 years he lived after that night, stop carrying those 7 minutes? The honest answer, supported by everything we know about combat psychology and about what McKinney's post-war life actually looked like, is almost certainly no. Not because he was broken, not because he failed to recover, but because the human brain does not forget total experiences. It files them. It returns to them. It processes them in sleep and in silence and in the unguarded moments of an ordinary life. What his post-war record suggests is a man who found a way to live with what he carried. He didn't destroy himself with it. He built a life that was, by any reasonable measure, entirely normal. And the psychological labor required to do that, to carry 7 minutes of something that no one around you can understand and still show up for a marriage and a farm and a community, that is its own form of sustained, invisible courage. Quieter than what happened on the ridgeline, less documented, no less real. He died on July 7, 1997, in Glenville, Georgia, 76 years old. If you do the arithmetic, you find that John McKinney lived approximately 18,975 days after the night of May 11th, 1945. In every single one of those days, somewhere inside the quiet Georgia farmer, were those 7 minutes. McKinney lived for 52 more years after that night. He never talked about what happened on that hillside. He never explained. He never asked anyone to understand. He just carried it quietly for the rest of his life. I want to ask you something genuinely. What do you think John McKinney thought about on his very last day? Not a hero's thought, a human one. Tell me in the comments. This is the kind of question that deserves a real answer, and I want to read yours. 3,517 Medals of Honor have been awarded since 1861. 472 of them were awarded for actions in World War II. Each one represents a human story, a moment when an ordinary person, in extraordinary circumstances, did something that exceeded what we generally expect human beings to be capable of. Most of those stories are unknown. Most of those men are buried in quiet places, remembered by families, forgotten by a world that has moved on to other things. John McKinney is one of those men. He was, by every account, exactly as ordinary as he appeared. A Georgia farmer, a husband, a neighbor, a man who fixed fences and grew things and died in the same county where he was born. And for 7 minutes on a Philippine hillside in May of 1945, he was something else entirely. Something that 52 Japanese soldiers and 9 sleeping Americans whose lives he held in his hands discovered at exactly the same moment. He was just a man who didn't stop. The hillside above Dingalan Bay is jungle again now. The foxholes have filled in. The ridge has reclaimed everything. The guns, the wire, the evidence. The jungle grows faster than memory. Somewhere on that hillside, there are still bones, returning to the earth alongside the roots and the mud and the insects that were screaming that night and went silent when the men arrived and started screaming again when the men were gone. The jungle doesn't remember. It doesn't record. It doesn't keep. That is what we are for. This is the story of Private John R. McKinney. One man, one ridgeline, 7 minutes, 52 dead, and a bent rifle barrel as the only evidence that any of it was real. If you think more people should know this story, if you think history at this level deserves an audience, share this video right now. And tell me in the comments, which part of McKinney's story hit you the hardest? The fight itself, the darkness, the Bushido doctrine, or the 52 years he lived afterward carrying what happened? I want to know. Comment below.